Hi, welcome to Here to There, hosted by Carolyn Taketa, former attorney, current small groups pastor, and life coach. Through monthly conversations with pastors, authors, and guests, we hope to stir your thoughts and encourage you to move from where you are to where you want to be, in your personal life, in your leadership, or in your ministry.
Well, as pastors and ministry team leaders, most of us would agree that leadership is hard. It often requires wrestling with difficult challenges, diving into messy relationships, and taking risks and making hard decisions without knowing if it will actually have the impact we want. Underlying all the stuff that we do as leaders is this role we have of influencing and developing others, and the impact that we have on those around us is part of our calling, and that's really the mark we leave for the sake of God's kingdom. So it's really important that we become the best leaders we can possibly be. So how do we do that? How do we know what we need to do to lead with all that we are and all aspects of who we are? And how do we leverage that, how God has wired us to influence people for Him and towards Him? And so today we're going to explore these big leadership questions with our guest, Jenny Ketron. And Jenny, thank you so much for being on Group Talk.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be here, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's such an honor for me to interview Jenny today because I have been a fan of her work and her ministry for many years. There are very few women who have served as executive leaders for large, influential, impactful churches. And so she, especially at a young age, I think when you were doing that over at Crosspoint in Nashville, you were probably in your late 20s?
Late 20s when I started at Crosspoint. It's kind of crazy to say, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? But, you jumped in and did whatever it takes to lead ministry and lead a fast growing church. So it was an honor.
Yeah. And along that process, Jenny's written several things. She is a writer, speaker, and leadership coach, and she consults with churches and nonprofits to help them lead from their extraordinary best. And she has a passion to lead well and to inspire, equip, and encourage others to do the same. She served as the executive leader at both Menlo Park Church in Menlo, California with Senior Pastor John Ortberg, of course, and the Crosspoint Church in Nashville, Tennessee with Senior Pastor Pete Wilson. So we've been in two huge churches. And Jenny's also the author of several books. I don't know when you had time to do that. You must not sleep. Including Clout, which is excellent, Discover and Unleash Your God-Given Influence. And then more recently, and the topic for our conversation today, the 4 dimensions of extraordinary leadership. And so for, this book I picked up, before I ever knew I was going to be talking with you about it earlier this year. And I really liked your definition of extraordinary leadership. So maybe let's start there. What differentiates someone from being ordinary versus extraordinary?
Yeah, that's so good. And I think, the passion for leadership for me was really birthed from this idea that as I got into places of influence and leadership, I began to realize just how big a deal leadership is. It's not just titles and authority. It's really earning influence with people. And influence by definition means the power to change or affect someone. And when you kind of live with that definition a minute and you recognize, wow, we have the power to change or affect the lives of the people that we lead day in and day out. And that's a sacred responsibility. I think it was in kind of my early 20s and I worked in the music business before I went into ministry full time. And, one of my first opportunities to lead another staff person, I handled really, really poorly. And I could tell you all this story, but I just started being a dictator and wanted this employee to do everything the way that I thought she should do it. And I was just kind of modeling what I thought a boss looked like. Mm-hmm. And then, it just hit me. I actually had a mentor say, Jenny, if you want to work with people, you need to learn how to love them and how to lead them, not think of them as like widgets or part of your grand plan to conquer the world. It's people aren't there for our good. We're there for their good. We're there to help them succeed and them thrive and them use their gifts to accomplish the things that God has called us to. And when I began to shift that paradigm of leadership, I just recognized, I've seen a lot of examples of really ordinary leaders, and I think we all could probably name, people around us or people who have influenced us and not necessarily always very good. And then we can look at, if I ask people, hey, tell me somebody who's influenced your life in a significant way, typically everybody can tell me somebody right off the bat. It's like, and it's often a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, or it could be a boss, or it could be somebody at their church. It could be their small group leader. It's like somebody who just was intentional in a moment. And that's, to me, what extraordinary leadership starts to look like. And obviously in the book, I give more framework to it, but I think that difference between ordinary and extraordinary is ordinary is just kind of you're doing the thing and with not a great recognition or an understanding of really the power of your influence on the people around you. And I think extraordinary leaders begin to understand how sacred that influence really is.
That's really good. I mean, it's one piece that comes out of what you just said is really about intentionality, right? So if we embrace that we've been given this, I think you call in the book, the sacred trust, to do this for the good of others, then that actually does change our lens completely on our day-to-day jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot about, your community of small group, leaders and directors and, people leading small groups and throughout churches. It's like the power of influence that happens in those communities, the way people's lives are changed and affected by the people who serve in those different leadership roles is absolutely remarkable. And when we catch a glimpse of that, it can change the trajectory for the people that we impact every day.
It's so inspiring. All right. So let's dive into these 4 dimensions of leadership that you identify in your book. Would you give us a brief summary and then maybe the upside and downside that we could talk about for each one?
Sure. So the way that the book is framed up is around the 4 dimensions, which are heart, soul, mind, and strength. And most of us are going to recognize that as, coming from the Great Commandment. Mark chapter 12, Jesus is, getting hit with questions about taxes and the resurrection. And then they say, hey, what's the greatest commandment of all? And Jesus replies with, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And so, ultimately that's kind of where this is rooted. Where it came from me was a recognition I started to really wrestle with as a leader that I needed to be intentional about being relational and connecting with people. I needed to be more mindful of how I was spiritually guiding conversation and investing in the lives of the people around me. I needed to be strategic and have a plan for what we were doing and how we were going to get things accomplished. And I needed to remember to have vision and remind people of where we were going and why we were going there. So those became 4 things that I kind of framed my leadership around in the early days. And then I was kind of reading throughout scripture and studying, different stories of the Bible of like leaders, just trying to help get a framework for what does healthy, God honoring leadership really look like. And I go to that Great Commandment and I'm like, here, and I just got curious because I was like, heart, soul, mind, and strength. I mean, that feels like, that's all these things that I've been kind of stumbling upon as a leader, that's really essential for leadership. And here it is in the Great Commandment, like the Great Commandment. And so I just kind of found that humorous, and I began to study that and the implication, Jesus could have just said, love the Lord your God. Like, that's the command. Love God. Like, that's really the command. And yet he clarifies with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And when you read a little bit more about the Great Commandment, you discover that the reason Jesus says, the implication behind why he clarified with those 4 things is he's saying that is your whole being. That is all of who you are. Your whole being is heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so he's saying, love God with all of who you are. And then, of course, the second commandment is love others, and the same can be applied there. And so love others with all of who we are. And if leadership is influence, and influence really is earned through loving and serving people well, then if we love people with all of who we are, it stands to reason that leadership should include heart, soul, mind, and strength.
So it's very comprehensive. Yes.
Yeah. And I think I think the conviction for me in it was that, as just naturally how I'm wired, I'm very strategic. I'm very much a planner. I used to say I put feet to vision, like that's what I do. And so, in that mind quadrant, which I say is kind of the strategy, system, structure part of us, I do that really, really well. But in the early days of my leadership, I did all of that, and I didn't really have a lot of relational connection with my team. Like, I wasn't as naturally just really good at building relationships and getting to know people and, and just just having that heart in my leadership. And so why this framework became so important to me as a leader is that I felt like God was saying, hey, but it's in you. Like, you don't have to just be the strategic leader. Like, I actually have created you to be a relational leader and a spiritual leader and a strategic leader and a visionary leader. Like, all of those elements are within you. And so to bring your best leadership, to bring extraordinary leadership, means to bring all four of those dimensions to the people that you lead.
So you think everybody has all four of these dimensions? Obviously, we lean more towards one than the other, but what you're saying is that the potential to develop all four is in everyone?
Yeah, that's my deep conviction. I believe that passage shows that God has put elements of all four of those things in all of us. Now, just like you said, all of us are going to be strong in one or two of them more than all, and not all four of them. And that's part of God's perfecting work in us, right? Philippians 1:6, that,
right.
He's perfecting us until the day of Christ Jesus. So, I'm really strong in mind and strength, the strategy and vision. I mean, I can do those things all day long. I have to really lean into developing that heart and soul in my leadership and recognizing the value that those things are to my team. And so, that's the encouragement that I give to other leaders when I'm talking about this framework, these four dimensions, is to say, yes, you're going to be naturally strong in one or two of these. A lot of ministry leaders are strong in heart and soul, which is a good thing, right? It's like you love people and you love God. And so you're committed to helping, committed to leading in those dimensions, which is really, really great. But we've all been a part of ministries where our relationships were strong and we were, spiritually just, healthy, but we didn't really have a great vision or a strategy for moving forward,
Right.
And then we've also been a part of things where it was all strategy and vision, but it lacked a little heart and soul.
Yes.
And so I just encourage people. I deeply believe that God's design, God's desire for us is to grow in all four of the dimensions, and at a minimum to have an awareness of the value of all four. Because, practically how this plays out for me is I know that I'm not as strong in heart leadership. So I need to put leaders around me who are strong in heart, because then together we complement one another. We lead better to the teams around us.
Sure.
And so it just gives you a little bit of an idea of, I think God has designed us to be, to lead from all four dimensions, but it's going to be part of our ongoing growth as leaders.
Well, I'm feeling much better about myself right now because I took the assessment that was in the book. And being a recovering perfectionist, I wanted all of them to be strong. And I'm feeling better right now, Jenny, because actually I am strong in the same two you are and weak in the other two, which kind of makes sense because we both came out of the marketplace. I obviously, as a lawyer, the mind piece is way higher for me. The heart piece is tougher. I don't necessarily, I'm not as sensitive to what people are doing. I don't think first of, how do I care for them? I'm thinking more of how do I get this done? So that's a journey that God's had me on to soften and to just be aware and to value that. And of course you think obviously soul should be strong because, we're in church ministry. So everyone should be strong in soul. And then in the book, you do a great job of not judging people for what they're strong and weak in. And you point out actually that there's different pluses and minuses. So let's run through that real quick. So if someone does the assessment and their number one ends up being their mind. So the strength of that we've talked about is the strategy, operational piece. What's the potential downside?
The potential downside is that we just run people over. When you're really strong in mind,
you're a driver.
You're a driver. Yeah. And, and people feel used or abused. They feel like they don't matter. They don't feel like they're seen. And so often I will tell people, that are strong in mind, like you and I are, I will say, hey, just slow down to see people, slow down to see people and recognize their strengths, gifts, fears, hurts, tragedies, joys, see what's going on in people's lives, because as you connect with them, you can help lead them. But if we're not we're not intentional to see what's happening with the people around us, we're going to cause more harm than we are good.
Yeah.
And I think for those of us that are strong in that dimension, that the mind, which is all strategy and systems and driving things forward, we just have to be careful that we don't run people over in that process.
That's a good caution. Okay. And then for the strength, this is the visionary leader, right?
Yeah.
So that's always really kind of exciting. They're usually the more charismatic and they have beautiful pictures of the future. Okay. What's the downside?
Yes. And the visionary people are fun people to be around.
Yes.
The reality is that they can get disconnected from everybody else because you're such a big visionary and everything seems like a possibility. And and it seems simple. And what I often see happen with people who are great visionaries is that they don't realize what it realistically will take people to get dream done. And so they unintentionally also kind of discourage people because they just see these big ideas and they think this stuff just magically appears. And the people who have to do all the work are going, we can't get this done. You're making us crazy. Or, oftentimes a visionary will have a number of different new ideas all the time,
right.
Like
fatigue.
People, and I have a bit of this in me too. The strength side, the vision side is my second highest one. And so I have to be careful of this because I'll have a new idea and a new initiative that I want to run with. And, I can leave my team frustrated because they're like, but do you realize how long that's going to take? Or I always think things can get finished quicker than they actually can.
Right.
Because I'm so eager to keep moving on. So the visionary has to just manage that of recognizing, and I think this is where even the visionary can really engage the spiritual side of leadership, the soul side, in that they really pause to discern timing, pacing. Is this idea a vision that God's really given me? Or is it, the pizza I ate last night? Or, so I think visionary leaders just have to recognize that they're always going to be running way ahead of the rest of the pack. And so they need to just be mindful of that and recognize that they need to make sure they're not exhausting people, really, at the end of the day.
Right. That's good. And then the heart people, they're the people who are always concerned about how others are being impacted. So they're the sensitive ones, right, on a team.
Yeah. Yep.
And they're the feel good, caring. They're the ones doing the birthday cards and the parties and all of that stuff. Which even just by my tone, you can tell I'm not really good at that.
Right. You're like all that fluffy stuff.
All that fluffy stuff. We have someone on our team that takes care of that because I'm like, I'm just not into that. But I do value it. So the downside of the heart person, someone that leads with that as their predominant strength, what's the downside of that?
Yeah, and it's like, and I've really learned to value the heart people because I realize how poor I am at it, and so it's like, I'm so grateful that somebody's making sure I don't forget, somebody else's birthday. Here was my dilemma. So I had my assistant who was really strong in heart who would do all that stuff, but then I would miss her birthday or because there was nobody to help me make sure I actually remembered her birthday.
So perfect.
So here's the downside to the person who's really strong in heart is that they can have a tendency to be a people pleaser because they're so in tune to what's going on with people. They care so deeply about people and they're relationally just very sensitive to the dynamics that they can become a bit of a people pleaser. They also can have difficulty holding people accountable. So especially when you're in a leadership situation, that person who is really relational, everybody feels like their best friend. Everybody feels comfortable talking to them, but it's quite difficult for them to have the hard conversation when a hard conversation is necessary. It's hard for them to hold their team accountable or do, just check-ins on, are they getting stuff done? Are they being accountable to, whatever, is their responsibility. And so that's the danger for the person who's really strong in heart is that they have to develop a little bit of that mind, that system, process, structure that helps them hold people accountable, so that you get the balance of those things.
That's good. And then finally, the soul piece is the spiritual component, right? So it's the prayer life, and I think for me, in shepherding small group leaders, it's a lot about paying attention to what God's doing in them, apart from what we need from them. And then prioritizing that above necessarily, what the task requires. I think that's been a discipline for me to go, okay, seems like God's doing something different, and maybe to step off leadership for a bit, which is really hard to do because we really need the volunteers. So, so the soul side, I think, just pays attention to people's work, what God's doing in them. What is there any downside to being a soulish leader? Because that all sounds really good, right?
Right. I know this is the hardest one. I'll often, when I'm working with, a team and we're talking about this, I'll have them divide up and talk about the pros and cons for each dimension. And when I have the team do the pros and cons of leading from soul, they're like, are there any cons?
Exactly.
This sounds really good. This is spiritual leadership. This is like,
Jesus.
This is Jesus. This is being formed like Christ. But so there are not that many, but here's what I would say is that sometimes the person who has that very keen, just like that spiritual formation, like that's kind of their core. They're real intentional about, just how the organization is doing, how the team is doing, how's the spiritual life for themselves, for their team, and all of those things are really good. What can happen sometimes is those can become platitudes of like, I'm praying for you, or I'm, and then they don't always follow up on that. That can actually be really discouraging to a team if you're quick to say, hey, I'm praying for you, but then you actually don't. Right. That can be, so there's a subtlety of a danger of somebody who is so conditioned to think that way, but then doesn't always follow through on it. It can have a real negative impact for people. The other side of that is sometimes somebody who's really strong in the spiritual dimension of leadership and soul is going to pray about things so much, but never take action on them, so I have to say this really gently because I don't find, here's what's ironic. When I do this with churches, usually the soul, those who are strongest in soul are the smallest group, which everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is a church. Should soul be the strongest for all of us? And I actually think it's always like a good eye-opening thing to say. Sometimes we get so busy doing ministry that we forget to minister to one another. And so I think rarely do I see this overused, right? I mean, but there can be a danger sometimes of that if we will be praying about something for so long that we might not actually take action on it, and so that can show up sometimes. So there's not a lot of dark side of this one, but there's a couple things to pay attention to.
Yeah, and the one that popped into my head, Jenny, was sometimes there's people who have a tendency to over-spiritualize something. And because they put a lot of Christianese and spiritual things next to it, it's harder to counter it. It almost becomes like if you're in a committee with someone like this, it almost becomes a stopper where you can't move forward because that decision has such spiritual implication. But if it's the color of the carpet, really, there's not a huge spiritual implication for it. But that, of course, is my bias towards process. So I'm like, is this really a spiritual decision or not? I mean, certainly for ones that are spiritually impactful, we do need to pause and seek the Lord and spend time in that. But sometimes I think it's becomes a default that isn't helpful in moving the mission forward. So I think this is really helpful. I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's good to value all four of these and to be aware of what you are and where your strengths and your weaknesses are. But I'm wondering too, like we talked briefly about teams and how teams carry different pieces of these. And if you have a weakness, then it's good to have somebody else on the team that's stronger. Do you think that's the role of community in leadership that I find that if I'm working on a team that is strong in something, even if it's something I'm strong in, I tend to see what the weakness is and I try to shore those up. I don't even do all that consciously. If there's no leader, I will lead. But if there is a leader that's good, then I don't need to lead. Like if someone's bringing the soul piece, I don't have to do that. But if I feel like we've made a lot of decisions and there's been not a lot of spiritual input in it, then I will bring that, even though that's a weaker thing. Like, do you think, am I weird or is this kind of typical?
No, actually, you're not weird at all. It's somewhat typical, but I think what I love about that, Carolyn, is that you actually see when there's a gap, which is great, because I think a lot of leaders would lead just from their dimension and not be aware when a dimension is missing. And so, you're picking up on, oh, somebody needs to take the lead here, or, oh, somebody needs to kind of take the spiritual leadership on this conversation, and you're stepping into it. So what I love about what you're saying, and this is really kind of the heart of this for me, is that I think as leaders, we need to be aware of all four of the dimensions, knowing which one we're strongest in. And I'm really strong in mind. I'm somebody who can build plans and strategies and put processes in place and help us move mission forward. So I know that when I walk into a room and with a team, that's one of the best gifts I can bring the team, is that dimension. Now, I need to be sensitive and aware enough of the need for heart, soul, and strength. Sure. And I need to value those in the other team members. And so I love what you're saying too, is that when you recognize a gap, you help bring that to the table, which is awesome, because I think, we want to play into that strength, because some of our personality, some of the gifts that God has given us, our wiring, like, for example, my spiritual gifts are leadership, administration, and knowledge. Well, no wonder mind shows up as the strongest for me. Right? So it's not, I do think that's a lot of the way that God has designed me, but I think he also wants me to grow and be aware of relational leadership, spiritual leader, visionary leadership, sure, and help grow and bring those. And the more that I surround myself with people who have those, the more I see myself growing in it. So it's not just focus on your strengths and don't worry about the other ones. It's yes, bring your strength, bring the one you're strongest in, and then continue to be aware of the need for the other three, and whether the other teammates bring that or whether you can bring an element of it. Like, make sure that as a team, all the four of them show up, because that's where I think extraordinary leadership emerges. I think that's when we see some of our healthiest leaders and our healthiest churches, is when all four dimensions are a part of the conversation.
In your consulting work, have you noticed that certain churches have a higher priority or higher value on one of the dimensions? And I wonder if that then makes us if you happen to have that one, great. And you'll probably get promoted and you'll just be totally in sync with senior leadership. But say your church is highly driven culture, I would guess they would probably really value the visionary and the strategic, perhaps. It just seems like, well, how does that context play into it? Do we just bring forth the best of who we are, regardless of what context we're in? Or do we shape some of our leadership dimension to fit what our context is valuing the most?
It's such a good question. And this is probably one of my burning passions for the church right now. And the church, the Big C church, is that I think I often see when I'm working with churches, I often see either churches that are really strong in mind and strength. So they have the overarching strategy and vision down, like they are, and so you see this a lot in a lot of our biggest churches, because obviously they've had big visions and they've put great plans behind those and made it happen. Conversely, I'll see a lot of churches that are strong in heart and soul. It's like they've got great community, a commitment to spiritual formation and discipleship, but they often might be a little stagnant in growth or forward movement. And so I often see churches, and I put those in four quadrants, and the top half of those quadrants is heart and soul, and the bottom half of those quadrants is mind and strength. And so I'll either see churches really strong in heart and soul, or I'll see them really strong in mind and strength.
And I'm guessing it reflects the senior leader.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was about to say, is it usually reflects the senior leader. And what I do see is the churches that I see the best representation of all of them are usually senior leaders who have put other leaders around them that bring the other side of the other dimensions.
Oh, that's wise.
But it's rare. Typically, and we see this all the time, and it's our nature as humans, is that we bring people around us who are like us. Mm-hmm. And what grieves me is that I think our churches I think some of the dysfunction and the unhealth that we see in our churches is sometimes because we're lopsided. We are strong in two of those dimensions and not in all four of those dimensions. And as a result, we might have great heart and soul and culture and community, but we're not really moving forward with mission, and so we're not seeing people come to faith. We're not really living out that great commission. Or you see churches that have that vision and strategy down to a science, and they are building great big infrastructures, but they're often criticized for lacking heart and soul, right?
Right.
And so I deeply believe that our greatest leaders, our greatest churches are going to emerge when we have churches that really bring all four of those things are at the leadership table, because everything rises and falls on leadership.
Yes.
It becomes a reflection of that senior leadership. And so if senior leaders could really be wise to make sure that their teams represent all four of those dimensions, I just think that's when we're going to see God's Spirit just unleashed on our church. And not that it hasn't been, but I just think we would see it even more fully, you know?
Yeah, I completely agree. And, it's an exciting thought, actually. I think it actually lends itself to leading more with teams, which actually a lot of small group ministries do, because you do leverage the strengths. I can't believe how quickly time has gone by, but I wanted to ask you this, and we can run a little bit over, and we ask your patience in listening. One of the most compelling parts of this book, is about 35 pages in, and you, it's within this chapter called Leading from Within, and it's a section that I think was also an article, in one of the blogs. It's a section titled Tough Truths About Self-Leadership. And I thought this was such a great wake-up call for us, as leaders, and a great place for us to close out this conversation. This line just like came in between the eyes when I read it. It says, no one cares more about your personal development than you do. And here's the real doozy. No one else is responsible for your leadership development. And it's so easy for us to go, gosh, I wish, so-and-so was investing in me more in my leadership. And, you know, I wish this was different about our team or whatever. And the woe is me and all of that. Or why am I not getting opportunities to develop these other areas, that I'm gifted in? And you also say, you can't wait for someone else to lead you, and no one else owes you that. And it's like, okay, Jenny, these are all true, but they're hard to hear. And I just wanted to ask you what prompted this section, because it just so resonated.
Yeah. And it's like when I write that section, people always are kind of cringe. They're like, oh, come on. But, I think what it is I'm saying, leaders, we've got to lead ourselves well. We've got to take responsibility for, again, that sacred work of leadership means that we have the power to change or affect the lives of the people that we lead. That is a big deal. And we want to steward that well. We want to, be intentional about pouring into developing and helping others be the absolute best they can be. And even though no one else cares about this or is maybe doing this for us, could we do this for others? Could we do this for others? And so rather than sit or whine or be frustrated that maybe I didn't have a mentor who invested in me in the way that I really wish someone had, or I just didn't have the leadership infrastructure at the church that I was a part of, like this other church does, or,
Sure.
We get into the comparison game, don't we? And so it's me just saying, leaders, just take responsibility. One of my favorite passages of scripture is Galatians 6. And the last phrase of verse 5 is, take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. And that's the Message translation. But that take responsibility thing is like, what? God has given us this life to steward. He has put it into our hands. And so it's our responsibility, we can't point fingers or blame or be frustrated that somebody didn't help us. There are so many resources at our disposal. I mean, the great thing is you've got, thousands of listeners who are listening to the podcast because they have looked at these tough truths in the face and said, okay, I'm going to take advantage of resources that are out there to help me grow. And so that's just exactly it. There are so many resources at our fingertips these days. You can be mentored from, leaders from afar. I always say that. I have mentors that have never met me, but because of the resources they create, they are pouring into my life day in and day out, because I'm soaking up some of the wisdom and things that they've put in written form or in podcast form or whatever form. So I think leaders just recognizing, what, this is your one and only life. Don't wait for somebody else to pour into you and all of those things. Really seek out, what is God asking you to do with it? And then just take responsibility for developing the leadership gifts that he's given you, because he will. He's so faithful in that.
Oh, that's such a good word, Jenny. And you've certainly stewarded your leadership gifts very well in mentoring and putting stuff out there for us and these resources. So if you don't read anything else in this book, I really recommend reading that particular one, because it really was a great thing to wrestle with the Lord over. So thank you so much for your time, Jenny. I really appreciate it. God bless you and your ministry.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It was such an honor to be with you guys, and so grateful for what everyone does and just leading in the local church. So thank you, guys.
Well, I highly recommend Jenny's book, 4 Dimensions of Extraordinary Leadership. You can get that on Amazon or anywhere else. This is a great book actually to read with your team and discuss together. And you could even figure out which of the 4 dimensions you are and have a fun conversation around that and help you understand each other better and what strengths you bring to the table. You can connect with Jenny on Twitter or Instagram at Jenny Ketron. And also her website, jennyketron.com. And she blogs pretty regularly. And so you can get more resources from her and read from that. And she also has a consulting website, get4site.com. And you can connect with her if you're interested in having her come and help your team out. So thank you for listening to Group Talk. If you like what you hear, I invite you to take a minute and leave us a positive rating and a brief review on iTunes, because that helps other small group ministry leaders find us. Thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Here to There, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.